So the question of why do we need another luminaire, or anything for that matter, starts with the question of what is the benefit to people. And I believe that we have a responsibility to design things that represent us in this time. Our work is defined in part by what came before us, and it's also a projection into the future. And by marking this moment in time, the work that we do becomes, I believe, timeless, because we are designing with respect to human needs primarily, but also reminding ourselves that we live in very exciting times. And I hope that AMBITUS accomplishes all of that. I think, well, being a guardian of the built environment means really that we are protecting the human experience, because we live in designed environments. We're living in the world that we are creating. And for me, that just means showing respect to the past, which gave us this day, to the future, which we will create, and also respect for people that, for whom we're stealing moments of consciousness from, and to the planet, which is in dire need of our care and from which we steal resources. So whatever we do has to be worth it. And that sense of responsibility comes into everything that we do. For AMBITUS, it is very much a human-centric light. It's for people. It's not a functional solution purely. It goes beyond function to become something which creates emotion and a sense of spatial belonging and enclosure. Hence the name AMBITUS, which means the enclosure of a melodic line or a range of notes in music, in a musical piece. So yeah, design begins with an open mind. This is something I've come to as my own personal mantra since many years. I realized it comes from my days in architecture school, when I didn't allow myself to just look at magazines and to look at what is out there and try to replicate it. And I tried to find my own place in the design world and find my own purpose in what I was doing. And so, it's a hard place to begin. It's that terror of the blank page, and it is terrifying. And in fact, I'm always frightened when I begin a project. I wonder, will it happen again? Will I have an idea again? So there is that terror. There's not a guarantee almost. And I think that doing that act without a safety net is what makes it more powerful and poignant, because you have nothing to fall back on. And I think in those moments, your attention is focused, your drive is very much in the moment. And that's what I mean by design begins with an open mind. The way that I achieve this, I think it's a state of mind where I try to perceive that there's an absence of something in the world. I create that space of absence in my mind. It's almost meditative. And then, because nature abhors a vacuum, it gets filled with ideas. The imagination provides the answers. And that's how I work. And out of that comes something, I hope. Well, don't get stuck. I think when we get stuck, it's because the process was failing us. We took shortcuts. And when we take shortcuts, the process runs out of steam. If you have a good process and you have respect for the process, then the process will keep giving you energy back and keep driving the process forward, and you should never get stuck. Getting stuck means one's taken a shortcut. And that's what makes design so difficult. That's what makes it also so powerful. It doesn't matter what kind of project it is, you have to treat every project with its due respect. Well, and the idea for AMBITUS emerged when I was working on a project in the UAE. It was a building that was geometrically very complex, a triangle that became a hexagon halfway up and a triangle at the top. And following the modernist tenets of Mies van der Rohe, where the lighting has to follow the structure and express the building, I realized that it was impossible to do it with either linear lighting or square or rectangular fields of light, superimposed on this crystalline structure. It just didn't work. And I remember the moment, I just realized that the only way to solve this would be to have a triangular grid of points that allowed the points to basically follow in straight lines through this building and fall away where they would. You could never do that with square rectangular lighting. And so at night, a building is defined by it's delineated by its light, by its lighting. That's primarily what we see. And if the lighting is not respecting the geometry of the building falls apart at night. And we've seen these examples. Even in London, walking on Euston Road, there's an example where the light the geometry collides as you see the corner, turning, going up. And I think that we shouldn't be making those kinds of compromises when we could do so much better. When we look at what the ancient civilizations accomplished without compromise, we should do better. So out of that came the idea for a circular luminaire. And because we're talking about the office environment, which is very demanding from a lighting perspective, because if we're using monitors and the universal glare rating is very important in order to create comfort in that space, we have to create light in a certain way, which means direct and indirect. And with the low glare rating, there was nothing on the market. In fact, I think there still isn't anything on the market that satisfies that need. And that's why we created AMBITUS. Well, so my creative process, it's a difficult question because my creative process changes for every project. In fact, this is something I learned from filmmaking. I took some time in not mid-span of my career, but mid-span of my career so far, let's say. I took time to satisfy an obsession I had with film. I really wanted to make films, and something I'd wanted since I was little. So I did courses in film direction and screenwriting, and then started making films. And I started to appreciate more the idea of the narrative being the essence of a piece of work, whether it's a novel or a film, and the need to commit to the narrative and to drive the narrative is everything, is that sort of closed world that you create. So this idea of creating a closed world is something I brought forward into my process. And so when I start a project, so when I was younger, I was probably a little more dogmatic. I had the belief that you had to have a very rigid point of view on things as a designer, and you had to do things in a certain way consistently. And I realized that I didn't have to leave my fingerprints on every product. And what was more important is that every product had its own story. And that came from the filmmaking experience. And so my process now changes from every project. But generally, in fact, every time what I do is I start with the facts. I think it's important to get that out of the way. So, a good product, a successful product, will be one that is grounded in reality. And I don't mean just function, I mean the reality of the economics, the marketing aspects, the application, the use, but at the same time that is conceptually inspired and also beautiful, right? So all these things have to happen. And at the start of the process, I start by understanding that world, creating that milieu, that space in which the product will exist. So that means understanding the client's needs, their aspirations, how they view the market, where they want to be in it. Technical restraints, materials, everything, right at the beginning. And then I start to work. And when the answers come from somewhere, when the answers arrive, they've already been informed about what they need to be. And so, we close the funnel as a team. I work with my team, and we have an understanding of this world. So we set the stage, we create the world, and then we all work within it. And that's also good for the partnership with our clients, because we create this collaborative space where everything is understood at the very beginning. So we don't have a loss of direction, or we don't have a loss of energy. We know, all of us know where we're going. It's like taking a journey. You pack in a certain way, and you take that with you, and you get to your goal. So that's the process. And then, let me start at the beginning of that. Really, I tend to work in my mind a lot before I start sketching. So I experience the product or the project before I've even seen it. And that's kind of the first test. That comes from my training, my early training, where we didn't have computers actually in the beginning. When I was a student, we had to do everything by hand, drawing everything, making models, right? There was no 3D printing, there was no visualization, which meant you had to visualize in your mind. You had to see the project in your mind. You had to think in 3D and 4D, be able to walk around it. And I'm able to do that. Probably because of that training, we didn't have the ability to just visualize. And so that process really begins in the mind, and then it becomes sketches, and then it becomes 3D, and then it becomes 3D prints or models or prototypes, where we start to understand the nuance of form and scale and materiality, and all of that develops very quickly. Because we know where we're going, because the process already is defined at the beginning. Yeah, it depends on what it is. It's an interesting question, because we have lots of tools in our toolbox as designers. I realized at one point I missed my pencil, because we're doing so much digitally, and I pulled my pencil out of the case again, because with a pencil you have more nuance of shading and form, and that's kind of in my imagination. That's sort of the sort of syntax of form is very important, and so sometimes it's a sketch, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a piece of clay, and you can't always explain things visually. Some things have a sense of touch. I think form is experienced in the body as well. It's hard to describe that, but there's a kind of kinesthetic reaction in the body when you experience form. If you imagine something like a beautiful horse, it's not just a profile. You feel the musculature, that beautiful mass, and you have a reaction to that power, that majesty, and that happens in the mind. That's where you can appreciate it. You can't really do that in a sketch unless you're Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo. They could do that. So we're thankful to have those drawings. But in fact, yes, it's for me it's important to work in 3D. In fact, I feel more comfortable sculpting than drawing. For me, sculpting is very natural, and I've done projects where my sculpted form became the tool for the product. There are a few examples of that. Yeah, it's, again, that goes back to my days as a student, where the idea of architecture is so expansive. It expanded I started to realize a sense of responsibility that we have as we're building things for people, whether it's buildings or spaces or objects. The responsibility is really that I feel that if we do anything, we have to create amazing experiences. And I think that comes from my desire to optimize things, to optimize experiences. And it comes from music. Why do we listen to music? We listen to music because we want to be elevated, we want to be transported, we want to be transformed. Nietzsche said something like, without music, life would be unbearable. And I think that's partly true. And why would it be unbearable? Well, I think it tells us that we need to do a better job as designers. We have to bring music into the world. In fact, again, from my days as a student, I learned as much from Miles Davis as from Mies van der Rohe, one from St. Louis, one from Aachen, but in some way kindred spirits, the idea of saying more with less. And it's not just minimalism, it's not just the idea of reduction, because yes, a line or a square or a circle is reduced and minimal, but it doesn't necessarily have poetry. And that is what comes through in the work of Mies van der Rohe, or the melodic lines of Miles Davis, where there are gaps and spaces and a sense of yearning, a sense of something intangible, which is not easy to achieve in the constructed world, because it is very tangible. We have to draw things, but it's in how you conceive it. So in my career, it's a lifelong struggle to capture the experience of elevation and engagement that music gives us in design. So how do we connect ourselves to the here and now to create a sense of belonging in space and time? It's the greatest challenge of our times, because right now I feel that most of society is trying to escape from reality there's gaming, the world's created with gaming, or there's the ideas of putting us into this meta universe, which I don't agree with, I have to say. I think that this escape from reality is very destructive for our consciousness, for our spiritual kind of essence, for our being, for our psychology, for everything that we are. I think that being human means something. It's in some ways a test. It's like, all right, you have a life. What are you going to do with it? You're a person. What are you going to do in your life? That sort of sense of being and belonging in the moment is our biggest challenge right now, because there's so much temptation and so much kind of distraction away from the here and now. We're thinking about everything. We're not seeing things around us because we're glued to our phones. We're experiencing information and, bleeps on our phone and little messages, instantaneous flashes, and there's a lack of depth in that. And so when I'm working, I'm very conscious of that, and the way that we choose materials and the way that form and materiality come together. Partly there's a bit of science to that, obviously. There's the technology of how do you make something. There's the choosing the right material to do the right job, the performance of a material. Today, we have a different imperative, though, because it used to be that we could have any material we want, we could have any product we want, when we want it, where we want it, and it can be any color. And now when we're experiencing the logistical challenges that we have and the sort of shortage of materials, or the understanding of what material production means, whether it's plastics, where the waste is dumped into the stream, into the rivers of China, and going into our oceans, or lots of other processes that are damaging to the environment. We're now becoming conscious, and I think that when we make material choices now, we have to think about the planet, we have to think about what's happening. So when it comes to color, I think naturally most products tend towards the neutral spectrum because they have to coexist with lots of other things, so we tend to keep it quite neutral. But when I'm working with metals, for example, aluminium, which I think is a beautiful material, why paint it? Why change it? And that understanding also came to my mind more recently when, again, it's part of the, I would call it choice by necessity rather than desire in a way, because there was a time when we chose certain materials because we had to. It's all that was available, and now we can have anything. And I think that it might be good to take that responsibility, the sense of responsibility back of choosing materials because we have to, meaning because it's better for the planet. And so when we choose, as in the case of AMBITUS, recycled aluminium, which is raw, at the end of its life cycle, you take it apart and you drop it straight into the hopper, and it's becoming a new product, a new something. And that is how we need to think about materiality. And I think that by understanding that sense of connection to materials, or a connection through materials to the planet, it makes us more conscious of our environment. Because, when I talk about the sense of belonging to the moment, part of that has to do with, I think, in our times, because there's a certain dissatisfaction with our world because it's more artificial, it's distracting, it's more digital. We have less of a connection to nature in some ways. There's a sense of ugliness in the world at times when it's over-functionalized. When we do things with just a functional intent, there's often a loss of beauty. And I think people react to it. And then they become disconnected from their environment. When that happens, they become disconnected from the environment, capital E. I think that by connecting us back to our environment and to the world that we live in through spatial experiences, we will in fact create or change the mental state that we have about the environment. That way we realize we belong to it and it belongs to us. I think we will be more responsible. So it sounds like a long road, but in fact, I think it's a kind of referred pain. It's not just tackling the problem directly, but indirectly, by making the world more beautiful, we'll care for it more. There's an example of this in New York City. There was a police chief who had a sort of zero tolerance policy. Like when windows were broken, they repaired them immediately. When there was litter, it was cleaned immediately. And by having this attitude of caring for the environment and not allowing things to decay, it changed people's behavior towards it. Because when kids see an old factory and 20 windows are broken out, they're going to break 20 more. So I think this is kind of the state of our world. We've got 20 broken windows, and we don't feel bad about breaking another 20. So this is why design has a really strong place in solving the climate crisis, because it's all about us. It's our state of mind which creates the problem in the first place. So when I say guardians of the built environment, that's part of it. By bringing more beauty in the world, we will elevate our sense of responsibility and solve the climate crisis. So the idea of AMBITUS. So firstly, if we start at the very beginning, where does light come from? Well, not that far back. I don't mean the Big Bang or Genesis. I just mean the sun. When we look at the sun is an unbounded source of energy and light. And with modern lighting, my experience has been that we often try to direct, control, shape, and put the light in a certain kind of format, which in some senses is desirable. Like if we're talking about projection lighting for theater, for art galleries and things like that, absolutely wonderful. When we're talking about creating illumination, however, I wanted to recapture that sense of omnidirectional light in AMBITUS. And so the circularity of it, the way that we designed the light engine so that the light is not diminished or controlled, but it's allowed to completely express itself in a natural way, in the way that the sun does, especially the indirect component. And we have this amazing light distribution from it. I mean, that comes back to the efficiency of the fixture and the fact that you can get a lot more light from the energy that goes into it, which obviously has a benefit from a sustainability point of view. But also, I think from a spatial perspective, what we're creating is in effect an artificial sky. That balance between indirect illumination and direct illumination, that we could control it and tune it up and down, change the color that's washing the ceiling to perhaps cool blue, not quite blue, but a cool white, and then warmer light direct, which starts to simulate the effect of the sky. And we can't negate the fact that we've been on this planet as a species for 100,000 years more, whatever. And we have been conditioned to live under this sky. And when we are suddenly living indoors most of the time, I think most people spend too much time indoors. We all do. AMBITUS is a way to create a more, I would say, ethereal source of light, a way of lighting a space that you feel that kind of expansiveness that you feel when you're outside in nature. And it does work, and a lot of people who have seen AMBITUS have commented that the quality of light is gorgeous. There's this feeling, and I think that we are evoking a sense of nature, a sense of that wonderful sky experience with AMBITUS. So it is doing its job, the one that we set out to do. Purely linear lighting doesn't really do justice to complex geometries or organic forms. Sometimes it could work. We can take an organic form and create an array of lines that, work within it. But in the modern world, we're very often using these gridded ceilings, which have these square or rectangular fields of light, which are being manufactured to a great extent all over the world. That kind of lighting does not work with complex architecture. It simply cannot, because there's always a geometric collision. And I think that there are a lot of compromises in that space. And, I think we're beyond that. We shouldn't be accepting those compromises. And so, with a circular fixture, because it doesn't have that, XY orientation, it's omnidirectional, it will relate to any shape, any object. And you can array it in many possible ways, and it will never be wrong. The space that we're in, the lights here are not following a grid. Now, if you did that with something square and you started to kind of turn them, it would be very chaotic and it would feel uncomfortable, a bit jangly. Because they're round, they all have a relationship point to point to each other and to the space. It's hard to describe in words, I think, but that is the trouble with putting light in a square, in a box. So the idea that we're putting something fragile into an environment which is about efficiency, performance, and facts, I think it's not a contradiction, actually, because if you think about a ballerina who is fragile and graceful, yet very powerful. There is a way for these things to coexist. And I think that, in fact, most of the things that we look at for inspiration, like birds, the beautiful, graceful shape of a wing, or planes for that matter, or horses or a beautiful car, there's a sense of grace and elegance and lightness that that we associate with these things. The things that are hard and massive and edgy, that denote power. It's a difference. If it's a different type of power, it's a destructive power, I think, or an overly aggressive power. There's a source of power which is very graceful, and that's what we're going for here. And when we talk about the business environment, it's not just about efficiency and performance. In fact, yes, a good business and a good organization runs with those things, but that's not why they're existing, to be inefficient. They're not a machine. I think an organization is more of an organism, hence organism. It actually connects that organic quality of an organization, which is about people. And because people have a state of mind, a state of consciousness, we have to serve that first. And by doing that, amazing ideas will come out of that. And this is, I think, the reason why businesses exist, is to do something that makes a difference. And so having something which inspires thought and inspires imagination in the business environment is doing a really great thing for business. So the idea of new work, this is, I suppose, in part because of the pandemic we just experienced, but I think that it's not as recent as that. Really, this has been a long time in the making. When we adopted computing in our working lives, and then adopted mobile computing in our working lives, everything has changed. We're able to work anywhere. We're able to, which is good and bad, because it means you can never shut off. But we can work anywhere. We could adapt our work to different environments, whether it's a cafe or a hotel lobby or a desk at home or the kitchen table at home. That experience of work became heightened with the pandemic, of course. And now that we're coming back to it, we're questioning what we really need, what we really want. In part, what we're saying is that the workplace needs to do more for people to be content with working in a space that requires them to commute to it. It has to be worth it. It has to be worth going there. And I think people aren't accepting anymore the idea of being put into a uniformly lit, gridded ceiling space, which is a hangover from the Industrial Revolution. It's a factory kind of thinking, the idea of linear repetition and putting people in there and asking them to do things and be creative, where they prefer to be in a space that maybe has more of a connection to nature, allows them to be mobile, to move around, to have more real sense of life. And this is what the office has to become. The office has to become real, not a machine. It has to stop being a machine. It has to become a real space, a living space, a space where people can interact and be their best and be inspired. Because really, without inspiration, we'll never have good ideas. Without inspiration, we're not going to solve the problems in our world. And that's the obligation of the workplace, to actually create those spaces. So AMBITUS, because it's not linear, because it's not the infinite line, it's circular, and a circle is derived from a point. It creates a space, it creates a place, a center point around which people can gather. It's like the campfire or the Knights of the Round Table. It's like so many things around which we huddle around something. It's protective almost. And so that sense of space, even primitive huts, tended to be round, not square. You know, we're actually quite conditioned to relate to the circle, and yet we ignored it. And the reason why is because it's more efficient and easy to make squares and straight lines. So in a way, we respect machines and the machine process more than we respect our own humanity in that sense. We put that ahead of our human needs. And with AMBITUS, we're putting our human needs first. And I can say that the reason why there hasn't been a luminaire like this is because it was very difficult to design and manufacture. We've cracked it now and we've arrived at a good place, but it was a challenge. And Zumtobel was brilliant to work with, to realize it. So what do the users of AMBITUS experience? I believe that AMBITUS creates a relationship with people in the sense that it is something which marks a point in space, and you have a relationship to that position, as opposed to something which is linear or gridded, which is impersonal, and impersonal meaning, in a way, inanimate, in the sense of it being machine-like or system-like. Whereas AMBITUS is more of a natural form. It's a natural marker of a point in space. And so the relationship to that point is grounding. It's a bit like sitting underneath a tree or next to a tree, maybe even knowing that there's a tree. It's just, there's a relationship to it that is very comforting, I believe. And also, it is creating a space by virtue of the glow that it creates and the natural diffusion of light that gradually tails off. When we think about workplace and the old idea of creating uniform lighting everywhere, it flattens space. It makes space dead somehow. There are no shadows, really. There's no sense of difference between one space and the next. And that's not real. That's not real. And so AMBITUS creates places that have more intensity of light, that again, they gradually, gradiate into a bit of shadow, and then there's light again. And that sense of modulation of light in a space is much more interesting, much more beautiful. Yeah, the idea that individual or personal expression is necessary for good design. It might sound a bit egocentric in a way, but I think I should explain what I mean. What I mean to say is that it's not so much personal expression as much as it is personal conviction, knowing why we're doing something and believing in the quality of it. Again, the example of Mies van der Rohe or Coco Chanel, who did the little black dress, there was no precedence for that. And it's completely minimal and reduced. And she found a form that hadn't been created before. And those moments of genius, those sparks of light that we have in the history of design, again, Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier and Charles Eames and everyone else, they are the guiding lights, actually. But what happens then if we start to follow those trends, those styles, those ways of thinking, we lose that spark of genius, because then we're beholden to some idea that's external from us. So what I'm saying is, when we design, we have to have conviction in why we're doing things, and that gives it power, and that gives it gives identity and personality to something. And when something has identity, it can stand on its own in relation to a human and then create a rapport with a human. So back to the beginning, it's not egocentric, it's not imposing, it's actually showing respect for people, that we're doing our very best by creating objects or spaces that have identity and rapport with people. So how do we achieve timelessness in design? It comes down to beauty, I believe, and what is beauty. And the trouble with beauty is that we don't accept that there is a definition of beauty, because we all say that it's a subjective thing, which in part it is. But I think there's beauty in many ways to describe it. There's beauty in a moment, an experience, in something, in the way that a child says something, in the way that the sunlight, strikes a beautiful old wall, and everything else that we know to be beautiful. So beauty is a sense of quality, a sense of completeness, really. And the timelessness can only happen, I believe, in a true sense, if we are loyal to our times and to do things that are relevant to us now. So the obligation is that we take the world we're living in, the raw material of our existence, the materiality, the technology we have in our hands, and our ability to do things, and also the awareness of who we are as a civilization, as a culture that has changed and evolved over time, and respond to that. But always remember that, in essence, we have not changed since our earliest days. We're still humans that respond to light, respond to form and shape and color in very much the same way as we always did. I mean, we could say the color red means different things to different cultures, means different things, but I think the physical and the kind of emotional reaction to it tends to be the same, and we can never prove that, of course. But in the same way that music has a certain effect on people, and we can say, I don't like opera, or I don't like, R&B, rap, but if there's quality in it, you can appreciate, yes, there is quality, and you'll understand if something is dissonant or out of tune or not. And so there is a sense of being able to create things that are, in this definition, beautiful and belonging to our times, which will then make them timeless. So what should we be prepared for in the future of office lighting is we should be prepared to give up the old idea that lighting is purely functional. And yes, there's a functional need for lighting. We want to have 500 lux on the tables, so the norms tell us, and we need to have a certain quality of light to be able to do the things that we have to do. Light is the most powerful transformer of spatial experience there exists in architecture. It is the most essential part of architecture. That immateriality of architecture is light. And yet we treat it in such a functional way. And it comes down to the profession changing its attitude, starting with the architects who need to know more about light or demand more from light, demand more from the experience of light rather than simply looking at a simulation of the amount of lumens that are entering a space and being satisfied with that. It's there is a science in it, but there's also an art. And we have to decide whether we are building just to serve functionality or if we're building for people. And yes, there's a functional need that people have, but more than that, people deserve to be happy. They deserve to have spaces that make them feel fulfilled, that make them feel valued, that make them feel that they belong in this world, which, that's a show of respect to humanity that we have to do. Light has the potential to be very beautiful. And that's what we need to be prepared for. So when I experienced the cave paintings at Lascaux and other Stone Age sites in France, we're all aware of these paintings. We've all seen the images, but when you're there, you start to wonder why they would bother to do this at a time when they were struggling just to feed themselves. They were living in a world that made them prey to wild animals that they had no protection against. They had so many challenges just for survival, and yet they were making art. And that should make us question the validity of Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, that, the basics come first and then we become enlightened. And what I realized is that art is as essential as food. That sense of creating a connection to the world around us, which is what art does. We take a space and we project our inner world on it through painting it. There are lots of theories that the cave paintings represented a celestial, a representation of the stars. There was a theory about that. I think a lot of people refuted that, but everything's possible. And they lived under the stars, and for them that was their highway, that was their landscape, that was their terrain. They were connected up and down, and so by making sense of that, they were able to create a sense of belonging. The idea that science is real and art is fanciful is wrong, because science is constantly overwriting itself. And so if science is always overwriting itself, that means that it can never be true. And it serves to get us a step ahead. Yes, there are technologies that help us get ahead, but science is not absolute, whereas I think art is absolute, in the sense that it represents the human needs, the human instincts, human emotion, which are constant and have not changed for millennia. So if we take that idea forward, we should not ever say that functionality, which is the equivalent of science, it's tangible, is more important than art, or the emotional needs that people have. And so when I say art is essential, and we have to bring that to design, that's what I'm referring to. And I think the cave paintings in Lascaux and the south of France and Spain all tell us that it was always a human need, and it still is. And I think that we're failing ourselves in this time that we're living in if we do not work with that intention. So the collaboration with Zumtobel was very special. Firstly, Zumtobel wants innovation. Since the times of the fluorescent tube and office lighting, Zumtobel was always at the forefront of technology, and I believe continue to be. There's a drive at Zumtobel which has to do with the human-centric experience, and using technology to fulfill that need. So working with Zumtobel, the ideas of AMBITUS that I was espousing, the need for this kind of circular luminaire, which effectively changes the direction of office lighting, was received by Zumtobel as a welcome innovation, as a way to go. And they put the technology in support of that idea, technology to serve the human needs rather than the other way around, And so in the whole process, we were often trading sides, where sometimes I would defend the engineering and they would defend the design, and we were trading sides, which was kind of an interesting thing, because it showed that we respected each other's points of view, we respected each other's contribution, in fact. And so there was a constant, I suppose, interplay and dance between the technical requirements and the human-centric requirements. And we always kept this in balance. It was not this over that. It was always in balance. That's what made the relationship really special, and the process very special. And this is really evident in the result. You can feel that it has integrity, and it's so minimal in its form. It takes no space. It sort of dissolves into space. It's not imposing. If you look at it, you can see it, but it also is very graceful in its presence, and it has a lightness in the space, which we achieved because of the support of technology that Zumtobel brought to it. The fact that we don't have visible cables power cables or data cables. Everything is run through the very thin structural cables. And so that's the first thing one should notice, I think. Because that's always a problem. How do you bring power to the thing? And we've done it without seeing the source of power. There's a kind of magic to it. And so technology is vitally important. And so when we talk about design for our times, serving the zeitgeist, we have immense power in the technology that we have through computational power, the ability to create programmable lighting that responds to human needs is a very powerful thing. And I think we've harnessed that in this very human-centric light.